Thank you so much, Cicely. The only problem with receiving such a wonderful introduction is now we have to live up to it. But I appreciate everyone coming out here to the amazing Lee Auditorium. My name is Paul Steensland, and my friend and co-presenter is CJ Hall. Today we're going to be talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. You think you know them? You probably do know about them, but we're going to be profiling 3 St. Louis Tuskegee Airmen. You may not have known that we have a history of aviation here in St. Louis. We're going to talk to you about it. This picture was taken at the Tuskegee Airmen Museum at the Tuskegee Airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, and here we are. So we are librarians. We're not historians, even though we both have a passionate interest in history, but we may not be historians, but we know how to find information. We have a lot of databases and resources at the county library that we invite you to come out and see. People like CJ and myself are committed to helping you find the information that you need, whether it's about the Tuskegee Airmen, which is an amazing source to look at, but we also have a lot of other sources that we can show you how to use. So I'm going to turn it over to CJ, who will tell you who were the Tuskegee Airmen.
Good morning, everyone. All right. Who were the Tuskegee Airmen? They were about 1,000 pilots who trained at the Tuskegee Institute, along with many men and women that did not serve as pilots. As an aside as well, there were many people that wanted to join the Tuskegee Airmen as pilots, but they literally didn't cut the muster. The requirements and the demands as pilots were very stringent. There were a lot of demands placed on them, and so they only took the cream of the crop. Many of the Tuskegee women who served as nurses, mechanics, and occasionally pilots were students at the Tuskegee Institute during the war, and quite a few remained in the Army or Air Force after the war. The purpose of the Tuskegee Airmen, who were they and why they served. The main purpose was to escort the military's bomber units, a necessary battle force during World War II. In order to reduce the number of casualties that the bombers would face, the 332nd Fighter Group was trained to stay with their bombers and not be pulled away into dogfights with Axis aircraft that would later change near the end of the war. Their discipline and attention to duty earned the 332nd Fighter Group an enviable reputation among bomber squadrons. It's important to note that each heavy bomber had a crew of 10 men. The bombers were well protected by machine guns, but were also large, slow, and unmaneuverable. Whenever a bomber was shut down, 10 men did not come home. This is why the Allied fighter protection was crucial to the success of the bombers. The Allied fighters were the ones that kept the German fighters at bay. Now, where did they fight? The Tuskegee Airmen flew from bases in Italy and Sicily and in North Africa. They flew combat missions over Germany, Italy, and Romania. They were also stationed in Puglia, which is the boot of Italy. They consisted of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Medium Bombardment Groups. Though they were trained, the 477th did not see combat in World War II. They initially learned their military and aviation skills at the Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University, as segregation within the U.S. Armed Forces was still enforced. They expanded their training to multiple airfields throughout the U.S. And before mid-1944, the U.S. Army Air Force doctrine was for fighters to stay above the bomber formations, but that led to some fighter pilots getting too aggressive and being lured away by the Luftwaffe. After mid-1944, the doctrine was revised to have the fighters fly well ahead of the bombers and engage in dogfights with the Germans. And as you might expect, the fighter pilots liked the latter tactic better, and it seemed to reduce the bombers' losses. And here is a map of some of the places that the Tuskegee Airmen served and fought. These are modern names for some of the different nations during World War II. And I'm going to pass that back on to Paul.
Okay, let's take a look at Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Colonel Davis was the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. You may hear us use terms like Tuskegee Airmen and 332nd, even though they're not completely the same, because, for instance, the 477th were not part of the 332nd Fighter Group, but mostly the 332nd and the Tuskegee Airmen were the same men. So Colonel Davis was the son of Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who was the first black general in the United States Army. Colonel Davis was part of the first group of Tuskegee Airmen to graduate. He was then Captain Davis. His leadership qualities were very evident, and he was somebody who tolerated very little indiscipline. He was somebody who was very strict about enforcing the rules. That's something that I want you to remember for the rest of this program. At the same time, Colonel Davis was very well respected by his men. They realized that he was stern, but he was fair. He enforced the rules equally. He was not harsh in his discipline, but he expected you to adhere to his form of proper behavior for an airman. You notice this is Colonel Davis wearing a B-3 flight jacket. If you have a chance, go out, take a look at the flight jackets we have outside. Those are reproductions of actual World War II flight jackets. And this is the only picture that I was able to find of Colonel Davis smiling. He was not a man who was known for his sense of humor, but I'm thinking he was smiling because he was about ready to get into a cockpit and fly. Something else about the B-3 flight jacket: sheepskin lined, very heavy. If you have a chance, go out, lift up the B-3, see how heavy this is. The only time that you see Tuskegee Airmen in the B-3 flight jacket is in training here in the U.S. The Tuskegee Airmen were trained to fight anywhere in the world. You only wear a B-3 flight jacket if you're above, say, 20,000 feet, because the air temperature was below zero. You want a heavy jacket. The 332nd Fighter Group fought in the Mediterranean theater, lower altitude. You didn't need these big, heavy flight jackets. So anytime you see Tuskegee Airmen wearing the B-3, they're in the United States. Didn't take them to Italy. So, moving on to combat tactics. This is the combat box formation. Is anyone watching the series Masters of the Air? Anybody watching that? Okay, if you are, you will probably recognize the combat box formation. This is how the bombers flew in order to mutually protect each other. They could cover each other with their machine guns. The job of the fighters in the 332nd Fighter Group was to make sure that the Axis fighters could not shoot down the bombers. As CJ was saying, each time a bomber goes down, 10 men do not return home, because all the fighting was taking place over Germany, Italy, Romania. Axis territory. So if these bombers go down, it's very hard to get back to Allied lines. And so that's why Colonel Davis was so rigid about having his aircraft stay with the bombers. He even said, if you leave the bombers and go off and try to fight the Germans, and you leave your bombers, don't come back to base. Find someplace else to land. Now, I don't know that Colonel Davis was serious about that, but again, he was not known for his sense of humor. So he wanted fighters, stay with the bombers. Here is an example of the combat box formation over Romania. You notice all these little black puffs of smoke. You know what that is? Flak, anti-aircraft. Those are gunners on the ground trying to shoot down the bombers. Now, the 332nd could protect the bombers from German aircraft, but flak, no protection from that. You just have to stay in your formation and bomb your targets. Want to introduce you to Captain Edward Gleed. He was the 332nd's operations officer, a very important job in the 332nd. Now, Captain Gleed did get up in the air. He did shoot down at least one, maybe two German aircraft, but his job was planning. That was his area of expertise. He retired as a full colonel in the United States Air Force. Story about Captain Gleed. After a particularly successful mission, two members of the 332nd Fighter Group, Lee Archer and Wendell Pruitt, were a little creative in how they landed their aircraft. They buzzed the tower and they did some maneuvers over Ramitelli Airfield, sort of like Tom Cruise in the Top Gun movies. I can only imagine the reaction of Colonel Davis when he saw these two aircraft violating Army discipline over the airfield. So he told Captain Gleed to discipline these two airmen. Captain Gleed said, Colonel, these men are performing aerial maneuvers that help them maintain their proficiency as pilots. And Colonel Davis was not terribly happy with Captain Gleed's response, so he assigned Captain Gleed a month-long assignment in North Africa overseeing cargo missions. And then, when Captain Gleed's assignment ended, he returned to the 332nd, and Colonel Davis wrote Captain Gleed a glowing officer efficiency report. So I hope you can see the message. Colonel Davis was saying, Captain Gleed, I want you to follow my orders. At the same time, I understand that you think these men were blowing off steam and deserved an opportunity to show their airmanship skills over Ramitelli Airfield. So I'm going to send my message, but I'm not going to hold it against you. So I see that as good leadership on the part of Captain Gleed for not disciplining the airmen who overflew the airfield. But I also see it as good leadership from Colonel Davis by saying, I expect you to follow my orders when I give them. But at the same time, I'm going to write you a great officer efficiency evaluation because you deserve it.
Was he from St. Louis?
No, ma'am. He was from, CJ, you may remember? He's from Kansas. Pruitt most definitely was from St. Louis. Wendell Pruitt. So here is Captain Gleed's A2 flight jacket. I hope you had a chance to see the A2 flight jacket that is outside on the table. You'll notice it's the same jacket that he's wearing over here on the right, with the 332nd Fighter Group patch on the chest. The diving red tail is a motif that you'll see in a number of 332nd Fighter Group jackets. Here is Wild Bill Campbell's A2. And that's Campbell's jacket on the left. He was with the 99th Fighter Squadron. The jacket on the right is mine. It's out there among the jackets, so take a look at it. I'm so, I guess, committed, maybe I should be, to World War II history and to the Tuskegee Airmen that I wanted to have my own jacket.
All right, and in our research, we learned about the Tuskegee Airmen of St. Louis Memorial at 2000 Dr. Martin Luther King Drive, outside of the Hopewell Center, which was formerly the Gateway Community Foundation, erected to honor the members of the Tuskegee Airmen. The names listed, these are some of the local flyers: Cortland Bivens, Clarence H. Bradford, Charles B. Brantley, Everett Bratcher, John E. Briggs, Robert T. Buck, Carl E. Carey, George Carper, James D. Carter, Nathaniel Covington, Charles T. Cross, John Davis, R.K. Dickerson, Paige L. Dickerson, Roger B. Duncan, Otis E. Finley Jr., Gene Flowers, Robert W. Frederick, Paul Freeman, Victor Hancock, Warren Harper, Lewis K. Harris, Morris M. Hatcher, Charles K. Haynes, William H. Holloman III, Leroy Kirksey, James B. Knighton, Charles A. Lane Jr., Milton F. Lemons, James L. McCullen, Theophilus D. Moore, John Moulton, Stacy Murray, Melvin M. Nelson, Christopher W. Newman, George G. Norton Jr., Henry R. Peoples, Wendell O. Pruitt, Victor Reef, Junius Savage, Clarence L. Shivers, John W. Squires, Norvell Stoudemire, Charles L. White, Hugh J. White, Isaac J. Wilford, William Wyatt, and John Ware. Now, these were the flyers. There were probably more people that served that may not have been recognized. During our research, Paul and I learned that one of our coworkers was born in Tuskegee, Alabama, and her father may have been one of the support staff with the Tuskegee Airmen. That may be potential programming for the future. Okay. Here's information with the Hugh J. White chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen International. The objective of the organization is to keep the memory of the Tuskegee Airmen alive and honor them through local events, including a scholarship program for high school students entering college and programs for minority youth that are interested in becoming aviators and studying aviation science. And this is a quote from the chapter's website. The chapter is named after Captain Hugh James White. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri on August 24th, 1922. He graduated from Charles Sumner High School in June of 1939. He was a member of the National Honor Society and president of his class. In September of 1939, he entered Stowe Teachers College, which is now Harris Stowe State University. In January of 1943, he volunteered with the United States Army Air Corps and was assigned to Tuskegee, Alabama as an aviation cadet. After graduating in class 44F as the first ranking student, he went on to the European theater as a pilot assigned to the 99th Pursuit Squadron of the 332nd Mission. He was shot down and became a prisoner of war. The war ended when he was in captivity. His story, however, does not end there. After an honorable discharge as a captain in 1951, Hugh J. White entered the Cleveland Marshall Law School. He passed the Missouri Bar in 1958 and specialized in criminal law. He was elected to the Missouri legislature as a state representative in 1961. and reelected in 1963. He helped organize the St. Louis chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen and was elected as its first president, and Mr. White passed away on December 14th, 1979. And now I'm going to pass this back on to Paul.
If you've been to Terminal 1 at Lambert Field, most likely you've had a chance to see the Black Americans in Flight mural. Everyone see it? So I have to admit, I normally fly out of Terminal 2, so don't often get a chance to see it, but every time that I do, I go by and just walk past and try to think of each man who's represented on the panel. The first St. Louis Tuskegee Airman we're going to talk about is Christopher Newman. He is here on the mural. We'll get a close-up of him right there. And during my research on Chris Newman, I read probably 15, 20 books on the Tuskegee Airmen, and I never saw anything bad said about Chris Newman. Like, everybody seemed to like him. He just seemed to be one of these guys that everybody had a story about, everybody had something to say. Oh, I talked with Chris Newman about this or that, and it makes me think that he's a guy, if I knew him, and unfortunately I didn't get a chance to speak with him, that I really would have liked. He just seems like that kind of guy. Here is probably the most famous wartime picture of Chris Newman, here sitting with his A2 flight jacket, with his baseball cap, with the bill flipped up, very common back in World War II. Aircraft's name, Goodwiggle, which was a dance of the time. And just Googling Goodwiggle, I found out that his granddaughter has a creative agency named Goodwiggle in honor of her grandfather. Chris Newman was born in 1922 in Mound Bayou, Mississippi, but he was raised in St. Louis. He served from 1943 to 1952. He retired as an Air Force captain, served in the 100th Fighter Squadron of the 332nd Fighter Group. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal 8 times, the Purple Heart, and the Congressional Gold Medal. Every Tuskegee Airman, whether they were a pilot, ground crewman, nurse, administrative officer, received the Congressional Gold Medal. The Gold Medal was presented to the entire group, but every member of the Tuskegee Airmen or their descendants was presented with a bronze replica of the Congressional Gold Medal. It was, I don't recall which president. Don't know the year either, but he attended Vashon High School. Now, I mentioned that the St. Louis County Library has a number of research databases, one of which is called FOLD3. That's F-O-L-D and the number 3. This is a fantastic database for researching military history as well as the men and women who served. So this is Chris Newman's registration card. I found these for my grandfathers as well, who also served in World War II. Notice he was 20 years old when he registered for the draft. Also shows that he was 5'8", 140. All three of the men that we're going to be looking at today were about the same height and weight. It is kind of small, I know, but by today's standards, men were shorter and lighter, but you have to remember they're also coming out of the Depression. Chris Newman's World War II service. Chris had a rough time in the Army Air Forces. During a training accident, he was flying a P-39 aircraft that caught on fire during a crash. And firemen descended on the aircraft, and they weren't sure whether he was alive. So he just shouted at him, "Hey, I'm still here. Help me out of here." Now, the thing you have to remember about the P-39 is it had a car door, like an automobile. So you'd open up the car door to get out of the aircraft. Well, Chris is trying to force the door open, but because of the crash, the door was jammed. And so the rescuers are saying, don't try to get out of the door or you'll get caught up and we won't be able to get you out of here, because remember, the aircraft's on fire. Well, Chris decided he was going to make his own luck, so he just starts kicking the door and finally gets it open and gets out. He was badly burned. He was in the hospital for 2.5 months, and back in the 1940s, burn care wasn't as advanced as it is now. So he was there for a while. But he healed, he recuperated, he got out, only to be shot down later in 1944. But he was rescued by the British, fished him out of the Adriatic. He was said to be the only Tuskegee Airman who survived getting shot down over the Adriatic. And he returned to service. He said, "It was a life-threatening emergency. When I was coming down out of the chute, I was bleeding. My plane was shot down." Captain Newman flew 84 combat missions in World War II. Post-World War II, he tried to become an airline pilot because that was good money back in the day. Unfortunately, the airlines wouldn't hire him. The reason why they wouldn't hire him was the airlines wanted bomber pilots. They wanted cargo pilots because bombers were 4-engined aircraft. Cargo planes, 4-engined or 2-engined. The airlines were flying 2-engine, 4-engine passenger aircraft. Easier to fly if you're a bomber pilot or a cargo pilot. Chris was a single-engine fighter pilot. So, like a lot of fighter pilots, he didn't get hired. So he stayed in the Air Force and ended up flying 97 combat missions in the Korean War. Almost 200 total combat missions, World War II in Korea. He later became a post office clerk and worked for the Defense Mapping Agency. He passed away October 21st, 2022, I'm sorry. He was 100 years old. Now I'm going to turn it over to CJ to talk to you about Wendell Pruitt.
All right, a little bit about Captain Wendell Oliver Pruitt, born June 20th, 1920 here in St. Louis, died April 15th, 1945 in Tuskegee, Alabama. He was only 24 years old. He was later buried in St. Peter's Cemetery in Normandy. There's a close-up from the mural. And according to historian Charles E. Francis, author of the Tuskegee Airmen, The Men Who Changed a Nation, Pruitt was naturally made out to be a pilot. And here's a quote. Soon his uncanny ability to maneuver his plane became so noticeable by other pilots of the group that he became the envy of those who flew with him. He was known to show off while flying, as been mentioned before, performing acrobatic feats and training that most pilots would not dare, which has been mentioned was discouraged by the airmen's leadership and specifically by Colonel Davis. He was also known personally to be quiet, very calm, did not brag much about his successes in battle, and he was also one half of the famous Gruesome Twosome. Captain Pruitt, along with Captain Lee Archer, are considered the most successful pair of Tuskegee pilots in terms of air victories. Both men were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Captain Pruitt also received the Air Medal with 6 oak leaf clusters. And here, a photo of him with Staff Sergeant Samuel Jacobs. It was pretty common for Captain Pruitt to leave one of his rings with Jacobs before he flew in combat. His parents were Elijah and Melanie Pruitt. He was a Sumner High School graduate and briefly attended Stowe Teachers College before transferring to Lincoln University in Jeff City, where he received civil pilot training and was offered that. And ironically, only 3 historically black colleges and universities in the country offered the pilot's course. He obtained a private pilot's license from the Jefferson City Airport while at Lincoln University. He also became a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. He graduated in 1941, accepted into the U.S. Army Air Corps Flying School in Tuskegee. He completed 70 missions, and some of note, December of 1942, he was commissioned second lieutenant, assigned to the 302nd Fighter Squadron, which is also part of the 332nd Fighter Group. As mentioned, he flew in 70 missions during World War II, and considered by Mr. Charles Brantley to be one of the number one fighter pilot. During the Mediterranean theater in World War II, he shot down 3 enemy planes, destroyed 8 others while on the ground, and in Trieste Harbor in 1944, Pruitt and other fighters destroyed a German destroyer ship using only their machine guns, which hit the ship's powder magazine, causing it to explode and sink. Here's some more information. Here is his registration card. We also got these from Fold 3, And if you look, it says he's listed as being 69.5 inches tall, which is about 5'10", and back then that was considered to be really tall. Also about 140 pounds. And of note, on December 12, 1944, Wendell O. Pruitt Day in St. Louis, Mayor Alois P. Kaufman called for a parade attended by large crowds of people, which was moved indoors into the city hall due to the extreme cold. He came home to help build morale with the war effort. He spoke here in St. Louis at Marshall School, which was also the primary school that he attended. He was soon sent back to Tuskegee to help train more fighters. But he expressed his concern about the poor condition of the planes that were supplied to African-American recruits for them to train. And a quote from Vesta Pruitt, which was Captain Pruitt's sister-in-law during his last visit to St. Louis, and this is listed online on YouTube from Channel 9's Living St. Louis program in 2001. He said, "You know what? I'm going back down to Tuskegee, but they give us the old, worn-out, obsolete planes, and they're nothing but flying coffins." In April 15, 1945, Pruitt took a student pilot in a trainer plane which crashed, and they were both killed. He was supposed to go back to Europe on that day, but his transfer was delayed due to President Franklin Roosevelt's death. He was 24 years old when he passed. A local high school and the famous housing project, Pruitt-Igoe, were named after him. The Pruitt Military Academy, which opened in 1984 and closed in 2007. And I'm going to pass that back to Paul.
Thank you, CJ. And the final St. Louis pilot we'll be profiling today was Charles Brantley. Now, Charles Brantley is primarily known by historians as one of 3 Tuskegee airmen to shoot down a German Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. Now, That's something that may seem incredible by today's standards, but only 3 German jets were shot down by the entire squadron. Charles Brantley got one of them. And to put this into context, the Messerschmitt 262 was about 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustangs that the Tuskegee Airmen were flying. They were flown by Germany's best pilots. The pilot that Charles Brantley shot down was an ace. He had shot down 7 Allied fighters, or 7 Allied aircraft. So this shows you how good a pilot Charles Brantley was. It also shows you, as if there was any doubt about how good the Tuskegee Airmen were as pilots, the fact that they went head-to-head with Germany's best aircraft and came out victorious shows you how good they were. He was born June 1st, 1920 in St. Louis, Missouri. Served from 1942 to 1963. He retired as an Air Force major, as part of the 100th Fighter Squadron. Honors and awards, a very long list. Distinguished Flying Cross, Airman's Medal 4 times, American Campaign Medal, World War II Victory Medal, Army of Occupation Medal, National Defense Service Medal, and the Congressional Gold Medal. He was educated at Vashon and Sumner High School. I'm not going to ask how that transition happened, but it must have been very interesting to go from Vashon to Sumner. Then later graduated from Stowe Teachers College, now Harris Stowe State University. I flew 42 combat missions as a fighter pilot. I was credited with downing one of the first jet-type aircraft in aerial combat. Flying, I liked and considered myself a real tiger. Yes, sir, Major Brantley, you were a tiger. Here is Charles Brantley's registration card. Shows you he was working for Union Electric when he registered for the draft. 5'8", 140. Now, CJ and I had the opportunity and the honor of interviewing Major Brantley's daughter, Kaylin Brantley McNeil. And she was gracious enough to allow us to photograph some of his artifacts in her collection. And it's an amazing collection. Here is Charles Brantley, or maybe I should say Aviation Cadet Charles Brantley's diploma from the Tuskegee Institute. Here is then Captain Brantley's Congressional Gold Medal. This is the bronze reproduction. And here's a photograph from the Post. I believe this was dated 1993, featuring Kaylin Brantley McNeil on the left, with her son, Joseph McNeil, in the center, and then Major Brantley on the far right. And CJ noticed a distinct resemblance between young Joseph and Charles Brantley. After World War II, he remained in the U.S. Air Force, serving in Germany, Korea, and Hawaii. Later worked as a meteorological weather officer in the military air transport service. One of his more prominent positions was as a personal briefing officer for the Pacific Air Force commander and his staff. He retired as a major in April of 1963.
All right. The Executive Order 9981, desegregation of the armed forces in 1948. It stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity of all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It established the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services to recommend revisions to military regulations in order to implement this policy. The advisory committee examined the rules, practices, and procedures of the armed services and recommended ways to make desegregation a reality. The committee, chaired by Charles Fahey, was terminated upon the submission of its final report entitled Freedom to Serve on May 22, 1950. There was considerable resistance to this executive order from the military, but by the end of the Korean War in the 1950s, almost all of the military was integrated. I think it's important to notice that because of the segregation within the armed forces and how well the Tuskegee Airmen fought and served, and just to get their own recognition and for them to be able to fight with others, and how that played a role in the current armed forces. And I'll pass this back on to Paul.
So as CJ said, the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy lives on today because of the courage and the competency of the 332nd that helped desegregate the armed forces. Harry Truman signed that executive order in 1948. Also in 1948, a naval ensign got his wings. Jesse Brown. If you've seen the movie Devotion, you know who Jesse Brown is. Jesse Brown was known as the first black naval aviator. But I'm going to let you in on a secret. There was another black aviator who came before Jesse Brown. If you want to know who he is, I'll tell you. So this is Ensign Jesse Brown. Now, I mentioned there was another black aviator who came before Jesse Brown. His name was Oscar Holmes. Now, at the St. Louis County Library, we're going to be doing some programs on the movie Devotion coming up. In fact, in a couple of days, we're going to be doing Flight of Devotion, the history behind the movie. We'll talk about Jesse Brown, Tom Hudner, the sacrifices that they made, as well as introduce you to the aforementioned first black naval aviator, Oscar Holmes. So if you have a few minutes of your day, come on out and join us. We'll be happy to see you. Also, the St. Louis County Library has a film festival, which CJ is a big part of. We're also going to be showing the movie Devotion in its entirety on Friday the 16th. I'll be talking a little bit about that movie, as well as show you sort of a history versus Hollywood comparison, showing clips of the movie. So I hope you'll join us for that. As I said, the 332nd lives on. There is currently in the U.S. Air Force the 332nd Expeditionary Operations Wing. Fortunately, St. Louis County Library's training manager deployed with the 332nd last year. And he brought us back some nice swag. If you see the hoodie over there on the table outside, that was provided by Sergeant Matt Lakin. So Matt, we appreciate your contribution. Here are some morale patches that officers and men in the 332nd are allowed to wear. My personal favorite is the Monopoly patch on the far right. Some photographs of Tuskegee Airmen wearing the B-3 flight jackets in training. Here is another A-2 flight jacket. This one is in the Tuskegee Airmen Museum in Tuskegee, Alabama. You notice a little bell on the collar? That's a Capri bell from the island of Capri, where airmen were allowed to have a little rest and relaxation time. The bells were considered good luck, so if you notice the A2 that's out there also has a Capri bell. Tuskegee Airmen in training with their training officer in the cockpit. This is the Sherman Rose mural, Dothan, Alabama. Sherman Rose was a Tuskegee Airman instructor. He never deployed overseas, but my father's side of the family comes from Dothan, Alabama. We drove up to Tuskegee, Alabama to check out the museum. And then we drove back. My uncle said, "You need to check out the Sherman Rose mural." And so we did. And we attended a wonderful restaurant in Dothan which serves some amazing hush puppies. Hard to get good hush puppies up here in St. Louis, or even good cornbread. I just have to tell you. And if you know some good cornbread places, please let us know. Like to thank everyone for coming out today. Hope you learned something. Hope you had a good time. Hope to see you at some St. Louis County Library programs coming up. Thank you so much for being here.